author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we are talking the two-term curse of presidents, why all eyes are on the 2026 midterm, with Donald Trump heading back towards the White House. The big question is, can he avoid the two-term curse? Well, that's the question. What is it? What does it mean? And can he, of course, as I've just iterated, avoid it? We're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and long-term host of this here radio show, perennial guest, Tim Donner. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
I'm really glad to have you, especially, in the wake of the election, analysis has become both a science and an art, and I think you offer the best of both in that. So let's get straight to the topic at hand, Tim. When presidents have two terms, they tend to spend the second term either as a king of foreign policy or a lame duck.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take?
Well, if you look at the second terms of the six presidents who've served 8 years since the passage of the 22nd Amendment in 1951, and I'll come back to the six presidents, but the 22nd Amendment was passed because even Democrats at that point felt that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, getting elected 4 times would suggest that someone could think himself more a king or a dictator than a president. So it was a very popular move to limit the term of any single president to 8 years or 2 terms. And it's a good law according to the great mass of the American people, but it hasn't served two-term presidents very well politically. The 6 two-term presidents we've had since the passage of that 22nd Amendment have all stumbled or sort of been frozen in place in the second term. Now, the 6 of them are Dwight Eisenhower, who spent most of his second term just playing golf. Richard Nixon, who famously was forced to resign because of the Watergate scandal. Ronald Reagan got hit with Iran-Contra. Bill Clinton had his famous Monica Lewinsky sex scandal. George W. Bush became almost irrelevant, and his approval numbers plunged into the upper 20s by the time he left. And Barack Obama famously was limited to his pen and his phone. This is the usual fate of second-term presidents. But like everything else about him, Donald Trump is in a unique position with a second term. The only president other than Grover Cleveland who would serve 2 non-consecutive terms as president. So the fact that he's had 4 years to ponder how he would do things differently than his tumultuous first term has given him a strength that he certainly would not have had and an agenda and a series of appointments faster than I think any president. He filled out his cabinet, has made 42 appointments to cabinet positions and executive agencies. It's put him in a unique position to act more like a first-term president. But beyond that, his second term is it's unique because it's going to be far more effective than his first term when he was a novice. He had no real alliances in Washington. This time around, he's had plenty of time to figure out exactly what he wants to do and who he wants at his side as he's doing it.
I think part of Trump avoiding that second term curse is that when a president is elected to a second term, it's often seen as a continuity. And it's, well, we can stick with what we know. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And so people are very comfortable voting for it. They don't expect anything different. But there's that unique insight that we've had, which is, here's what happens when you don't have Donald Trump. Now, in fairness to Joe Biden, there was, and the same for Donald Trump, which probably cost him the election, there was a pandemic to come out of. But then America had a glimpse of what a presidency without Donald Trump would look like. And we were told that the adults are back in charge. And they've seen And I'm sure this is a familiar phrase in America as well. It seems to have gone to hell in a handbasket under Joe Biden's leadership. And you have, well, for example, the latest news is out in Ukraine. They're thinking about the Biden administration, members of it, are thinking about sending nuclear weapons back to Ukraine to be based in Ukraine. They've allowed the attacker missiles to be fired, American-made attacker missiles to be fired into Russian territory. They've authorized landmine usage. I mean, since I was a child, we've heard about the terror of landmines and how these are a destructive force that last multiple generations. And yet, in the waning days of the Biden administration, you've got this chaos. And that's not to mention the economic chaos and the border chaos that we've had. And so the American public were granted a very, very unique insight into this is the alternative. So when they voted for Donald Trump, which they did so by even more than they did in 2020 and even more than they did in 2016. And so they had this window and they saw it. And it seems that the American public decided that I think we need more of Donald Trump. They collectively decided that because they witnessed the alternative, which they never had an opportunity to do so before, except for Grover Cleveland, as you point out.
Well, this is a rare opportunity for the American people, or it was, to put two administrations side by side, because both candidates, Biden, then Harris, and Trump, had records that they had to either run on or defend. And it was pretty clear who people preferred, because it's not like people suddenly took to Trump's personality, that the people who found him personally offensive suddenly said maybe he's not so much that way. It was all a matter of the record. And in a way, the grown-ups were the voters who said, yeah, we may not like him personally, but we're not electing him to come over to dinner. We're not electing him to take care of our kids. We're not electing him to be a pastor. We're electing him to be a president. So we had a rare opportunity there to have a side-by-side comparison of two administrations that actually occurred. No longer is Donald Trump I'm going to do this. I'm going to try that. Here's what I think I will do. This is, I've done it for 4 years. And the contrast was very sharp. You know, most second-term presidents, the reason that they can't get much done and wind up disappointed is because the moment they're reelected, they become a lame duck, right? All of a sudden, their power is not nearly what it was in those heady first 100 days of their initial presidency, initial administration. That's why the first 100 days in 2 years of any administration are most critical. But again, like everything else, Donald Trump is unique in the sense that he's much better positioned to actually accomplish the things that he would have liked to in his first administration. He tried to drain the swamp from 2017 to 21. This time, he knows how to empty the swamp.
Yes, you mentioned earlier that he's pretty much running at breakneck speed to bring in his cabinet appointments, and with the stepping down of from consideration of Matt Gaetz of Florida, it does seem that although there's still, of course, the stories and the innuendos about cabinet picks, something Tulsi Gabbard, people saying that she's a Russian asset, which obviously they weren't saying when she was a loyal Democrat. Which,
funny about that.
Funny, strange, I thought. Funny.
As the coincidence.
Coincidence only.
Coincidence.
It's Russiagate 2.0, right? And so you have...
Essentially, yes.
Yeah. And so you have him choosing all these people, and he knows now that because he's gone for really loyalty over anything else. And I think that's what really let him down in the first term, because it was a ship that was full of leaks, it was acrimony, and it was talking from two sides of the mouth. So whatever was happening within the White House, and then there was all the talk about he's throwing ketchup against the walls and things, which obviously completely unfounded in anything. May have been true, but it wasn't there wasn't any proof about these things. But they're talking about the discord, and I think that talk of the discord created discord. And this time he's gone for loyalists. Now, all this leads to one thing, and that is that Donald Trump pretty much has to get his agenda set and in place and proving its worth by 2026. And there's a deadline for a reason. We're going to talk about that after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by longtime host of this here radio show, perennial guest, Mr. Tim Donner. Tim, thanks ever so much for sticking with us. Earlier in the show, we were talking about how Trump could avoid the two-term curse. But what this really comes down to, and I think we both agree on this, is that everything that Trump wants to accomplish has to be in place by 2026. Now, could you tell our listeners and viewers why that is?
Well, there's a number of factors. We spoke earlier in the show about the so-called two-term curse and how a second term of a two-term president tends to not amount to much at best, or can be plagued by scandal, whatever. But a president, in this case Trump, who's really, you could almost flip his terms so that this is more like a first term, and his first term was actually more like a second term because he was stopped, at every turn and scandalized, and he just didn't know his way around the D.C. swamp. But it's always been true that a president coming in fresh, and essentially Trump has to get things done at the height of his leverage and his political capital, which is right after he's won an election, especially one that he won decisively. This is not like 2016 where he lost the popular vote. This time he won the popular vote. It's not like 2016 when his election was met by widespread protests. This time there were no protests because there was nothing to protest. The outcome was so clear, and he won the popular vote. So that gives him an incredible amount of leverage, especially for someone who has audacious plans for remaking the federal government over the next 4 years. Those first 100 days are when the voters and even the opposing political party are loath to demonize him, loath to oppose him, except to the extent they absolutely have to. And it also means that after the first 100 days, you put your most controversial things into play, which then opens the spigots for all the critics to second guess, to regret their vote in the case of voters, and to basically harden the opposition, which is really the point of opposing parties. But I think most of us would say the term loyal opposition has never really applied to the Democrats in the era of Donald Trump. But extend that out, and it's really 2 years where you've got to get everything done, or you have to presume that you must get everything done, because presidents almost always, and there's very few exceptions, lose congressional power in the midterm elections. The House will generally head in the opposite direction from the party holding the presidency. The Senate can tend to it's not quite as black and white with the Senate. But the point is, especially with someone with such a bold agenda of what he wants to get done, you have to expect by the time 2026 rolls around that Donald Trump will be on the chopping block for the Democrats. You'll have all kinds of fodder to use, not the least of which, for example, they'll run out one sob story after another of illegal aliens who were forcibly removed from their homes, and they'll be in tears or separated from their kids. That alone, even though a majority of the American people want mass deportation. Those stories are poignant for people who aren't paying a lot of attention to to politics. This is all a long way of saying that they could lose the Senate in 2026 because it's the opposite of this year.
There's the numerical advantage for Democrats.
The Democrats had to defend 23 of the 33 seats that were up here in 2024.
34, yeah.
34. It's almost the reverse in 2026 when Republicans will have to defend 20 or more seats and the Democrats will have opportunity. But this year, the Republicans did not lose a single seat that they held, while the Democrats lost 4. So that's all good and well and good for the Republican Party, but it's absolutely no guarantee that it couldn't flip in 2026, especially with such an explosively controversial president.
Yeah, there's going to have to be a lot more defense than offense this time around for Senate Republicans, and this comes under new leadership as well, with the new Senate Majority Leader John Thune replacing Mitch McConnell for the first time in, I guess, was it 17 years or something that he's been at the helm?
Give or take, yes.
And so you have a new Senate leadership with an inbuilt disadvantage. And I think it's going to, as you say, there's going to be a very, very contentious fight against Donald Trump, essentially trying to force through his, what we could really term, as you point out, his first term agenda, which is going to be bringing a lot of tears to a lot of people and maybe a lot of cheers from a lot more. But in terms of getting senators elected, this is going to be a real uphill battle for the GOP. Now, I actually think, Tim, just to go against conventional wisdom, I suspect that the House in 2026 will actually the GOP will actually increase its majority. And if I could present you with my theory on this very, very quickly, and you give me your idea on it. You had so many people who voted for Donald Trump, but didn't vote down ballot. And that's because Donald Trump is, in my opinion, is more popular than his party.
Which is a reversal of form from 2016 and 2020 when the down ballot candidates outperformed Trump.
And so there's this malaise with the two-party system in total, with both main parties. And so people are looking to Donald Trump to shake up not just legislation around the country, not just the things he can do with executive orders, but they're also looking to him to shake up the Republican Party. And I think that if he can do that shake-up, what we're going to see is a lot more Trump loyalists come out in the ranks of the GOP primaries, and that will actually solidify what happens in the House. We're going to be back with Tim looking at one of these key indicators after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm Mark Angelides. Continue to be joined by senior political analyst and longtime host of this here show, Tim Donner. Thanks for sticking with us, Tim. Now, at the end of the last segment, you brought up a point about whether Democrats could reclaim the congressional control in 2026. And your supposition was that if they ditch let's call it what it is, the woke agenda, as it's often referred to, if they ditch that, they have a better chance of winning back the people who were disaffected by their push in that direction. I think one of the key indicators on that will be what happens with the media. Now, the media appears to be, let's call it the legacy media, as it were. It seems to be flailing and trying to find its mojo. But if the denizens of that fourth estate, if they continue with their push on we must have open borders, every illegal immigrant that crosses deserves health care, deserves every right that Americans have, that taxpayers pay for, then I think that the Democrats will stay with that particular agenda because it buys them the airtime. But is the media essentially a sinking ship, which the Democrats might tie themselves to the mast of?
Well, I think that the same idea applies to the media as it does to the Democrats. Can they turn this ship around and raise their credibility again from 30%, which is where it's at now? 30% of Americans trust the media, which means 70% do not trust the media.
Seems about right.
As Bobby Kennedy Jr. pointed out, when his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was elected president, you had the likes of Walter Cronkite and David Brinkley, and it was about an 85% trust level for the media. That has now been cut more than in half. But part of it, too, is the fact that old media is realizing they're being supplanted by new media. Joe Rogan matters a lot more now than Joy Reid does. Millions more are taking in social media and podcasts, both, than are going back to the traditional sources of news. So there's the frustration that they did all they could to try and stop Donald Trump from winning again, and they failed. And their credibility went down even further in the process. And they know they're increasingly becoming more and more irrelevant. And that applies to newspapers as well. How many people below the age of about 40 are reading a newspaper? The answer is the percentage must be minuscule. So the media is in a position now. We see MSNBC is going to be offloaded by, and famously, Elon Musk trolled the leftists on MSNBC and elsewhere by saying, how much does it cost? Which is the same thing he asked before he bought Twitter and turned it into X, which is a lot more expensive, exponentially more expensive than MSNBC. Look, the days of old media, traditional media, are all but over. And the way that they have handled this last decade since Donald Trump entered the political stage has only served to quicken their demise.
It's I think that what's happened here is that they've tied themselves so thoroughly, the Democratic Party and the legacy media, the old guard media, they're so inextricably intertwined that they really can't pull themselves out of the swamp that they're in. I mean, we heard it on I was watching MSNBC all through election night. I had it on one of the many monitors that I were infecting my eyeballs. And they were talking about, we are losing. I can't believe that we are not getting this. We have lost Pennsylvania. And it was really, for me, it was the end of any subterfuge that they're an independent or non-biased organization, which should have been apparent from well before. But to me, this was an open admittance that we're one in the same. And you can't have a media that has trust. As you pointed out, it's down to 30%, the trust in the media. And when they align themselves with a political party, then what are they but a political party mouthpiece? So if, let's say the Republicans opened their own TV station called Republican TV, would you trust it for unbiased news?
Right, of course not. And, some critics have said, have made the obvious point that the left needs to renounce its attachment to wokeness, to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all this rot that the voters essentially decided to kick out. And one person put it this way, I don't remember who it is, but apologies to whoever it is that actually said this. And it's incredibly insightful. The idea that the Democratic Party should throw its far left wing under the bus is impossible because those people are the bus.
Mm.
So there's a deep entrenchment into left-wing politics in the Democratic Party. Now, look, it can change. 1988, we pointed this out during the election season. Dukakis, disaster for the Democrats in 1988, and along came Bill Clinton and turned it around. George McGovern, disaster in 1972, and along came Jimmy Carter and turned it around, even though he was a failed president and lost in a bid for a second term. So it is possible for a party to turn the ship around, but theirs has been basically for several years now has been the Titanic getting ready to hit the iceberg that was November 5th. But can they turn around their ship of state quickly enough? Will they accept that someone like Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania is the closest thing to the answer to their problems, at least at the presidential level? Or they will insist on being the disloyal opposition, which they've been to Trump. And look, even CBS News reported that 59% of the American people polled approve of the Trump transition. That number was much lower in 2016. So they've got a lot of serious self-evaluation to do. If they do it, they'll probably be okay in a few years. If they don't, they'll continue to sink like they did this year.
It's difficult to turn the ship around, Tim, if you're in a landlocked lake. Thanks for being here, Tim Donner.
Thanks, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us today KJ Helms, who is the founder and CEO of Johto PR Disruptors. Thanks for joining us, KJ.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
So KJ is here to talk about greenwashing, which is actually something that's become so pervasive in companies pretty much worldwide now, especially with the emphasis on making sure that everything appears environmental, at least on the surface. So, KJ, would you give our listeners a brief description of what greenwashing is and what kind of rise we've seen in recent years on that?
Yeah, sure. Greenwashing is when you say that you're environmentally sound or safe, and you're not. I mean, that's just really the gist of it, right? And it's it's been rising 300% in the past, couple of years. And how do we know that? Well, we're super transparent today. We have social media, we have a 24-hour news cycle, and it is harder and harder for companies to spin a message that's not true. It's just going to be found out.
So what are some of the more egregious examples that you can think of regarding a company saying that we're doing this in an environmental way, and it turns out they're basically just not?
Yeah, I mean, they could, say, financial firms. It's been, rising very heavily in that. Saying you have an investment fund that is sustainable, right? Or, there's stocks that are environmentally safe that are actually not, right? That's a great example.
It is. And that actually ties in with, I guess, is it called environmental social governance, ESG efforts.
Yes.
Now, with that, there's actually a lot of top-down pushing on that from governments, but it's also being pushed from the side as well. People corporations getting what are called ESG scores. So they're kind of being forced into a position. Now, obviously, they've chosen to take the positions on this, these individual companies, where they're measured, and essentially they get like a social or corporate governance score that can be deleterious to their investment opportunities and even access to finance. So essentially, it seems to me that there's almost a pushing and a pulling of trying to make companies greener, but they're incentivized to at least put out the blurb, even if that blurb's not necessarily true.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say there's no quality control in that process in the sense of being able to back it up, being able to back it up by reports that are not greenwashed by third party, outside entities, and just an authentic narrative that's, truly communicating what's happening today and possibly even how difficult it is to become green or sustainable. And what companies are doing. Maybe companies are not able to have that score that they need, but being transparent and communicating what it's taking and what they're doing and, what are the reasons why they're having difficulty with that would be way more transparent and would offer much more help and support than putting out reports saying that they are doing something when they're not, because the backlash is even worse than the report.
That's a really important point, I think. So you've got companies that are desperate to put out this information that they are doing something in terms of fulfilling their self-appointed, let's be very clear, their self-appointed environmental goals. And there's a lot of consumers who are looking to more environmentally responsible companies for whatever products or services they go for. And so they set themselves these goals, and then they're trying to bluster their way into saying we're doing something about it. However, I think your point of saying that if the company were to just say, well, this is what we're trying to do and this is where we're going, the consumer would have a much fairer idea of what they're actually getting into when they go into some kind of contractual obligation, whether that's a sale or a service. If they were just promoting, this is what we're trying to do and we haven't achieved it yet, rather than this is what we do.
Yeah, it's so true, because you can get into these false narratives of saying you're carbon neutral when you're not, right? Or, garments that are made from sustainable materials when they're not 100% made from sustainable materials, for example, maybe it's only 5%. So it gives this false impression. The problem is not just that it's a lie, but when you communicate over powerful communication channels to the masses, right? The backlash when it is found to be a lie is much more serious. I mean, a lie is never good from person to person, right? But it is deadly in public relations. The backlash is worse. And it even gets on and I'll say this, it even gets on the radar of legislation and government, and that's the last thing you want.
Tell me more about this. How is there legislation? Should there be legislation? And what is particularly happening in that field at the moment?
Well, there are more fines that are happening because of this. Listen, I think America is a country of laws, right. But I can also say this, legislation is slow for a very particular reason. We don't want so many laws that our self-determinism and our freedoms are taken away.
You're preaching to the choir here. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so I hesitate to say should there be more legislation or things like that, right? People should actually start applying PR and journalism ethics when they are putting out these reports. Because, again, the backlash is extremely fatal for a company. It causes litigation. It causes, brand evaluation, brand distrust. Companies spend way more handling false narratives that they've put out than if they were just authentic in the first place and had a strategy of how to communicate what they're doing to get to those goals and gain consumer support.
Yeah, it would be a nice position to be in where companies were completely honest about what they were doing. Tell me, what does your organization actually do?
My organization helps disruptive, innovative companies. When I say disruptively innovative, these are companies that have technology mostly, right? But new services or products that are changing the status quo. There's a lot of things today that need to be changed, right? And there's a lot of people out there that are looking to make their industries better, whether it's in finance, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in retail, whether it's in, you name it, right? And a lot of change needs education. And so what we do is we help companies take a transparent and narrative. We help companies take a narrative stance on being transparent and educating the markets of why change is needed, right? That's what we do.
It seems to me that essentially your outfit is encouraging companies to be honest. Is that it? Is that what I'm getting? I mean, I applaud it, but
I can tell you that a lot of innovators, and it's been a catalyst since COVID, right? COVID came around, and you have a lot of really smart technologists and entrepreneurs and people out there that have said, that's it, right? Like my quality of life, people's quality of life around me needs to improve. I'm no longer okay with lack of healthcare transparency. I'm no longer okay with the broken system in healthcare. I'm no longer okay with, financial illiteracy. And so they are coming out with fantastic technology and services and products that are really changing things for the better. And not to be trite, but they honestly do want to make the world a better place. But with that comes a great amount of responsibility in communication. And people today, they don't want to be greenwashed. They don't want to be snowed. They don't want to be lied to. They are very, cognizant of when they're getting a bunch of fluffy jargon, right? People like raw, genuine authenticity that they want to support.
I believe the saying is a lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoelaces, tying up its shoelaces, something along those lines. So with greenwashing, there seems to be an overall thing. People in general, with greenwashing, it's something that's not good. We got that. We've got that. But it's still
misleading. It is really a practice of misleading consumers into believing products, services, or practices are actually environmentally friendly or sustainable.
Yeah.
That's really what it is.
Very much so. And as you rightly pointed out, in an age of social media proliferation, and I would say there's more than 24-hour news cycle in the 24-hour period, but within that, you have such risk of being found out. And it strikes me that we have this idea that ESG, is supposed to be good for a company, whereas that does appear more like an outside force forcing a company to report things that might not be true rather than take action at perhaps a slower pace.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that does put pressure on companies to solve problems. And typically those problems get solved in ways of greenwashing, right? And this is another status quo that needs to be changed, right? There needs to be solutions so that the penalties aren't so great and companies are actually facilitated to get to that point rather than having to greenwash or feeling like they have to, I should say.
I think it was Ronald Reagan who said status quo is Latin for the mess we're in. KJ,
he was so ahead of his time, wasn't he?
Indeed. KJ Helms of Johto PR Disruptors. Can you tell our listeners where they can follow you and find out more about what you're doing?
You can go to jotopr.com, JOTOPR.com. You can learn about anti-PR, which is the antithesis of the traditional PR. It is the lack of reasonableness, I should say, with fluffy, antiquated messaging that doesn't speak to what's really going on today, and learning how to take control of your narrative in the court of public opinion to educate and to help your own company take control of its narrative.
KJ, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for in this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today. Of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners at home, for taking the time each week to tune in and join us. Please remember, LibertyNation.com does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.